A billionaire disguised as a homeless man asks a poor mother and her daughter for help in the freezing cold, and what she does leaves him shocked. Thomas Graham adjusted his navy blue tie for the third time that morning. It wasn't crooked. It never was. The adjustment ritual was just another habit among the many he had developed over the last 5 years. Small, predictable gestures that gave him the illusion of control over a life that, despite being perfectly organized, seemed increasingly empty. The reflection in the Venetian mirror showed a 40-year-old blonde man with light blue eyes that once held a sparkle, but now looked like 2 frozen pools in winter. There wasn't a wrinkle out of place, nor a rebellious strand of hair, just as there was nothing out of place in his 3-story estate on the outskirts of Dallas. "Mr. Graham, coffee is served." Mrs. Patterson's voice, his housekeeper, sounded over the intercom. Thomas did not reply. It wasn't necessary. He always came down for coffee at 7:15 a.m. after showering and dressing. Mrs. Patterson knew this just as she knew exactly how he liked his coffee, black, no sugar, and that she should not attempt to start conversations beyond the strictly necessary. The sound of Thomas's designer shoes echoed through the empty hallways as he descended the main staircase. The white walls displayed expensive, impersonal artwork, chosen by an interior designer to match the furniture. There were no photos. There were no memories. "Good morning, Mr. Graham," said Mrs. Patterson, pulling out his chair for him to sit. Thomas nodded slightly. "Good morning." The housekeeper retreated to the kitchen. Thomas picked up the newspaper and pretended to read it while drinking his coffee. The words danced before his eyes without making sense. Lately, this feeling of disconnection had become more frequent, as if he were observing his own life from a great distance. His cell phone vibrated on the table, a message from his assistant confirming the 10 a.m. meeting with potential investors. Another negotiation, a few more millions in the account, another day exactly like the one before. Thomas looked out the window at the meticulously maintained garden. Everything was under control. Everything was in the right place. And yet, everything felt wrong. The thought struck him with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He was suffocating amidst so much space, dying of thirst surrounded by water. Unwanted memories flooded his mind. Caroline, his ex-wife, blonde like him, with blue eyes that once made him believe in soulmates, packing her bags 5 years ago. "I'm sorry, Thomas, I didn't plan this." Her voice still echoed in his memory. "How long?" he had asked, his voice controlled, as always. "A year with Richard." Richard, his business partner, his college friend, the man who had been the best man at his wedding. The double betrayal had devastated him. After Caroline left, he simply shut down. He cut off friendships, reduced professional relationships to the strictly necessary, and dedicated himself obsessively to work. He turned his life into an impenetrable fortress, and it worked. His tech company tripled in value. His personal fortune grew exponentially. He bought the estate, hired employees who maintained a respectful distance, and established rigorous routines. Only recently had he begun to realize the price of that security. Thomas pushed the coffee away, almost untouched. He stood up abruptly. "Sir?" Mrs. Patterson appeared at the door, surprised by the break in routine. "Charlie won't be going to the office today," Thomas announced, the decision forming as he spoke. "Tell Frank to reschedule my appointments." Thomas went upstairs, ignoring the housekeeper's perplexed gaze. In his enormous walk-in closet, he saw rows of tailored suits, custom-made shirts, shoes aligned by color and style. For a moment, he stood paralyzed before that monument to his own emptiness. Then he reached for the back of the closet. There, in a rarely opened drawer, he found simpler clothes, jeans, t-shirts, items he wore on the rare weekends when he didn't work. He took off his suit. He put on faded jeans, a gray t-shirt, a dark blue sweater, and an unbranded woolen jacket. He looked in the mirror. The man staring back looked like a stranger. His eyes fell on the Rolex on his wrist. Beside it, on the dresser, was the leather wallet with unlimited credit cards. On the nightstand, the latest model smartphone. Without a second thought, he removed the watch and placed it next to the wallet and the phone. He felt a strange lightness on his wrist, an almost forgotten vulnerability. He hurried down the stairs before he could change his mind. "Mr. Graham." Mrs. Patterson intercepted him in the hall. "Are you going out like that?" "Yes." "Without your car?" "It's very cold outside, and snow is forecast. I'm going for a walk." "But sir, you aren't taking your cell phone or your wallet." "That's right," Thomas interrupted. "I won't be available today." Before the housekeeper could protest again, Thomas walked out the front door. The cold November air hit him immediately, sharp and invigorating. He took a deep breath, smelling the approaching winter. He started walking down the driveway that led to the street. The neighborhood where he lived was exclusive, mansions spaced out by acres of land, luxury cars in the garages, private security. No one would recognize him dressed like this. It was exactly what he wanted, a day of anonymity, a day as someone invisible. He walked for hours, leaving behind the tree-lined streets of the wealthy suburb, entering areas of the city he never visited on foot. The architecture gradually changed. Mansions gave way to smaller houses, then commercial establishments, and finally, more modest areas of the city. Hunger began to bother him around noon, but Thomas ignored it. There was something liberating about feeling a simple physical need. After years of being numbed by comfort, the sky gradually darkened, heavy clouds promising the predicted snow. The streets became busier as the workday ended. People hurried, carrying bags, rushing to catch buses. A man with his appearance would normally draw attention, tall, well-dressed, with a posture that betrayed privilege. But without the expensive suit, without the luxury accessories, without the imported car, he was just another face in the crowd. The first hours of this invisibility were intoxicating. No one looked at him expecting orders or approval. It was liberating. But as the day wore on and the temperature dropped, the experience changed. Thomas realized there were different kinds of invisibility. The one he sought, voluntary anonymity, was very different from the forced invisibility he observed now. By the time the snow began to fall, Thomas was already in a part of the city he didn't recognize. Small businesses, old buildings, a mix of ethnic restaurants and convenience stores. The snow intensified quickly. The cold penetrated Thomas's light jacket, making him shiver. The hunger, which had been just a slight discomfort, now gnawed at his stomach with insistence. For the first time in decades, Thomas Graham could not simply solve a problem with money. He passed a store and saw his reflection in the window. Hair disheveled by the wind, nose red from the cold, shoulders hunched, unrecognizable even to himself. The hours dragged on. The snow fell harder, thick flakes dancing under the streetlights that were beginning to turn on. The streets emptied as people sought shelter. Thomas continued walking, now visibly shaking. His fingers were numb. His lips were beginning to turn blue. He was about to admit he had made a terrible mistake and seek help when he spotted a small park. On one of the benches, partially sheltered by a tree, a blonde woman and a little girl were sharing what looked like a sandwich. Despite the cold, they were sitting there, talking animatedly. Thomas stopped a few yards away, observing the scene. The woman carefully divided the sandwich, giving the larger part to the child. Even from a distance, he could see that the woman's coat was worn at the sleeves, but impeccably clean. The girl, also blonde with bright light eyes, was laughing at something her mother said. There was something so simple and genuine about that interaction that Thomas felt a pang in his chest. How many solitary meals did he have at his enormous dining table? Without realizing it, he had approached too closely. The girl looked up and saw him. Instead of fear or suspicion, her green eyes showed only childlike curiosity. She tugged on her mother's coat sleeve. "Mommy, he looks hungry." The child's voice was clear and direct in the cold night. The mother, following her daughter's gaze, turned to Thomas. Her face, young but with premature lines of worry around her eyes, studied him for a moment. "Come on, honey, let's share our food with him." The response took Thomas by surprise. The woman gestured for him to come closer. Hesitantly, Thomas took a few steps toward them. "Are you all right, sir? You look frozen," she asked, her voice gentle yet direct. I'm a little lost. On a night like this, no one should be out on the street," she replied with a kind smile. I'm Grace, and this is my daughter Emily. Thomas, he replied automatically, surprised by his own honesty. Grace looked at the partially eaten sandwich in her hands, then at her daughter. A silent communication passed between them. Emily nodded. It's not much, but it's what we have, Grace said, offering the intact half of the sandwich to Thomas. We'll share the rest, won't we, Emily? The girl nodded again, her face lit up by a genuine smile. And Mommy always says that shared food nourishes more than food eaten alone. Thomas stood paralyzed by the gesture. His hands that signed multi-million-dollar contracts, trembled as he accepted the piece of simple sandwich. He couldn't remember the last time someone had offered him something without expecting anything in return. Thank you, was all he could manage to say, his voice choked with emotion. You can sit with us if you'd like, Grace offered. The snow is getting heavy. Thomas hesitated, then sat down. Emily watched him with the direct curiosity of children. Don't you have a home? Emily, Grace gently chided her. It's okay, Thomas replied, biting into the sandwich. It was simple. Just bread, cheese, and a little lettuce. But at that moment, it tasted like the best thing he had ever eaten. I do have a home, yes. I just got lost today. Sometimes it's good to get lost, Emily said with the improbable wisdom of childhood. Mommy says it's when we get lost that we find new things. Thomas looked at the girl, surprised. Then at Grace, who was smiling with a mix of pride and something that looked like longing. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Thomas noticed that Grace was trembling slightly. You two should go home, he said, concerned. It's getting dangerous out here. It is, Grace agreed, standing up. Do you have somewhere to go? Thomas thought of his empty estate, miles away. Yes, I do. Are you sure? There's a shelter 2 blocks from here. I'm sure, Thomas replied. Thank you for the sandwich. I don't know how to thank you properly, Grace smiled, a simple smile, without ulterior motives. No thanks necessary. Everyone needs a little help sometimes. Emily looked at Thomas with serious eyes. Are you going to be okay? The question, so simple and direct, struck Thomas somewhere deep. When was the last time someone had genuinely worried about his well-being? I will be, he replied, his voice husky. Grace took her daughter's hand. We need to go. Take care, Thomas. The two walked away into the increasingly heavy snow. Thomas watched them until they disappeared around the corner, 2 small figures against the white snow and the darkness of the night. He stood there for a moment, still tasting the simple sandwich. Something had shifted inside him, as if a small light had been turned on in a long dark room. He began to walk, now with a purpose. He didn't know exactly where he was, but he would find his way back. And tomorrow he would find that woman and her daughter again. He needed to understand how 2 people with so little could give so much to a complete stranger, while he, with all his millions, could not give anything to anyone. It took hours, but eventually, Thomas spotted the gates of his property. The estate stood imposing against the black sky. For the first time, he saw it as it truly was, not a home, but a fortress against real life. Something had changed. Thomas felt it clearly, as if he had woken up from a long sleep. The mansion continued to be an empty space, but now he saw the possibility of filling it, not with more things, but with something completely different. For the first time in 5 years, Thomas Graham thought about the future with something other than cold resignation. Tomorrow he would find Grace and Emily again. And perhaps, just perhaps, he would discover what it was like to truly live, instead of merely existing. Thomas didn't sleep well that night. Despite the physical exhaustion, his mind remained restless, filled with thoughts and questions. The estate, which had always been his safe haven from the world, now felt like a mausoleum of marble and glass, cold, impersonal, empty. The contrast with the brief interaction he had with Grace and Emily was so stark that it was painful. In the morning, Thomas woke up early and, for the first time in years, dismissed the meticulously established routine. He didn't wait for Mrs. Patterson to serve his coffee. He didn't check the messages on his cell phone. He didn't read the reports left on his bedside table. Instead, he went to the closet and deliberately chose simple clothes, dark jeans, a light blue shirt, a comfortable wool jacket, no ties, no cufflinks, nothing that referenced the Thomas Graham the business world knew. Mr. Graham. Mrs. Patterson found him in the kitchen making his own coffee. Her normally impassive face showed clear surprise. "Tice, did you need something, sir? I could have—" "Don't worry, Mrs. Patterson." Thomas smiled, a gesture that seemed to surprise the housekeeper even more. "I'm just trying to do a few things for myself today." "Are you going to the office?" Thomas hesitated for a moment. The company could survive one more day without him. "No, I have some personal matters to attend to." After coffee, Thomas took his least ostentatious car, a black sedan he rarely used, and drove to the area of the city where he had found Grace and Emily the night before. The previous day's snow had lessened, leaving the streets covered with a thin, glistening layer of white. He parked near the park where he had met them and began to walk, trying to mentally reconstruct the path the two had taken when they left. Grace had mentioned they lived not far, which could mean anything from a few blocks to an entire neighborhood away. Thomas had never felt so lost and, at the same time, so determined. He walked through unfamiliar streets, observing old buildings, small neighborhood shops, children going to school. It was a world completely different from his own, yet there was a vitality there that his meticulously controlled existence lacked. After almost 2 hours of searching, just as he was beginning to consider that he might never find them again, Thomas spotted a familiar figure leaving a small market. Emily, in her worn red coat and a school backpack on her back, was holding hands with Grace, who was carrying a small shopping bag. Thomas felt his heart race. He hesitated for a moment, thinking about what he would say, how he would explain his presence there. He took a deep breath and began to follow them from a distance, watching as they walked 2 more blocks to a small apartment building, painted a faded yellow tines with potted plants on the windows despite the cold. He waited until they went inside and, after a few minutes of indecision, approached the building. It was a simple building, with no doorman and a communal entrance door. The name Grace Marshall was handwritten on one of the intercoms next to the number 3B. Thomas felt ridiculously nervous as he pressed the button. What was he doing here? What did he hope to achieve? How could he explain to a woman he barely knew that he couldn't stop thinking about her gesture of kindness? The intercom crackled. "Yes." Grace's voice sounded distant and slightly suspicious. "Grace, it's Thomas. From the park, last night." Silence. A silence long enough for Thomas to consider leaving. "How did you find us?" Her voice was cautious now. "I saw you at the market and I'm sorry, this sounds strange, I know. I just wanted to properly thank you for what you did yesterday." More silence. Then a sigh. "3rd floor, apartment B." The intercom buzzed and the door unlocked. Thomas entered the small lobby and climbed the stairs, noticing the peeling but clean walls, the steps worn from use. Nothing like the marble staircase of his estate. Upon reaching the 3rd floor, he saw a partially open door. He knocked lightly and waited. Light footsteps approached, and the door opened a little more, revealing Grace's wary face. "Hello," Thomas said, feeling suddenly awkward. "I'm really sorry to show up like this. I promise I'm not some maniac." Before Grace could answer, a child's voice sounded from inside the apartment, followed by quick footsteps. Emily appeared next to her mother, her green eyes widening in recognition. "It's the man we helped," the girl exclaimed, her face lighting up with a genuine smile. Grace looked at her daughter, then back at Thomas, her expression softening slightly. "You look different today," she commented, noticing his clean clothes and combed hair. Thomas smiled timidly. "Yesterday I was a little lost, in more ways than one." Emily tugged on her mother's hand. "Let him in, Mom. He doesn't look cold anymore today." Grace hesitated, her eyes studying Thomas as if trying to assess any potential danger. What she saw seemed to reassure her, because her shoulders relaxed slightly. "I brought something," Thomas said quickly, holding out a package he was carrying. "Nothing much, just a thank you for the sandwich yesterday." Grace took the package cautiously, a simple box of pastries from the bakery Thomas had seen on the way. Nothing extravagant, Nothing that screamed money or ostentation, just a simple gesture of gratitude. "I don't know a world without self-interest," Thomas said, the words coming out almost on their own. "But with you, I saw a little bit of that. I want to learn." Something in the sincerity of his words seemed to reach Grace. She opened the door wider, though she still kept a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "For a coffee," she said, as if setting a clear boundary. "That's all." Thomas nodded, understanding her caution. "That's all," he agreed. The apartment was tiny compared to his estate. A small living room that opened into an even smaller kitchen, 2 bedrooms visible through partially open doors, and a bathroom. But there was something there that his luxury home lacked. Signs of real life. Colorful children's drawings were taped to the refrigerator with magnets. A stack of used books occupied a corner of the living room. Plants in makeshift pots adorned the windowsill. A worn sofa, but covered with a colorful, handmade blanket, dominated the small room. Emily ran to the center of the room, where several colored pencils and sheets of paper were scattered on the floor. She sat down and returned to what appeared to be a drawing already in progress. "Excuse the mess," Grace said automatically as she headed to the small kitchen. "We weren't expecting company." Thomas followed her, observing how she moved with ease in the cramped space, putting water to boil in an old kettle, taking chipped but clean cups from a cabinet. "It's a pleasant place," he said sincerely. Grace gave him a look that mixed incredulity and something like amusement. "You don't have to be polite. I know it's nothing compared to the kind of place you must live." "I'm not being polite," Thomas insisted. "It's cozy." The kitchen was truly small, just enough for a round wooden table with 3 chairs, an old stove, a refrigerator that made a slight humming noise, and cabinets with doors that didn't close perfectly. There were signs of improvisation everywhere, shelves made with painted crates, a dish drainer that looked like it had been repaired multiple times, curtains made of cheap but cheerful fabric. "Here we live with what we have," Grace said, placing the cups on the table. "It's little, but it's ours." There was a quiet pride in her voice that impressed Thomas. It wasn't defensive or defiant, it was simply a fact. They had little, but it was theirs. There was dignity in that simplicity. Thomas sat at the table, watching Emily through the kitchen doorway. The girl was completely absorbed in her drawing, lying face down on the floor, swinging her feet in the air as she colored with intense concentration. "She loves to draw," Grace commented, following Thomas's gaze. "Her teacher says she has talent." "I can see that," Thomas replied, noticing the way the girl mixed colors with an intuition that seemed advanced for her age. Grace put the coffee on the table, along with sugar and a small creamer. They weren't matching cups of fine porcelain like the ones Thomas had at home. They were different pieces, probably bought at different times, some even with small cracks, but the coffee smelled delicious. "Thank you," Thomas said, taking the cup. He took a sip and smiled. "It's great." Grace sat across from him, still with a slightly suspicious expression. "So, what do you really want, Thomas? People don't usually track down strangers they met on the street just to thank them for a piece of sandwich." The direct question caught him off guard, although it shouldn't have. Grace didn't seem like the type of person to beat around the bush. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure," Thomas admitted. "I just know that last night something changed. I have everything money can buy, but when you shared that sandwich with me, it was the first time in years that someone gave me something without wanting anything in return." Grace studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine if he was being sincere. "You're not trying to impress us or something, are you?" she finally asked. Thomas shook his head. "No, in fact, I'm trying to learn from you." "Learn what?" "How to truly live," Thomas replied simply. "Not just exist." Grace seemed about to say something when Emily walked into the kitchen, carrying her drawing. "I finished," she announced proudly, holding out the paper for both of them to see. It was a colorful drawing of 3 figures, clearly her and Grace, and a third figure that Thomas realized, with surprise, appeared to be himself. "That's you sitting on the park bench with us," Emily explained, pointing. "I made your face happier because now you're not cold and hungry anymore." Thomas felt something strange in his throat, a knot of emotion he wasn't accustomed to experiencing. It's very good, Emily. Thank you." The girl smiled, radiant with the compliment. "Do you want to see my other drawings?" Before Thomas could answer, Emily was already running back to the living room, presumably to fetch more of her creations. Grace watched her daughter with a soft smile, then turned her gaze back to Thomas. There was less suspicion now, replaced by a cautious curiosity. "Do you have children?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "No. I almost did. My ex-wife and I were planning to, but..." He stopped, surprised by his own willingness to share something so personal with a near stranger. Grace nodded, not pressing for the rest of the story. "Emily is 6. It's just the two of us since she was 2. Thomas wanted to ask more, but felt it wasn't the right moment. Instead, he watched as Emily returned carrying a stack of drawings, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. The scene was so simple and yet so profoundly different from everything else in his life. Here, in this small makeshift kitchen, with a cautious woman and an enthusiastic child, Thomas felt strangely at peace. There were no expectations, no hidden agendas, no constant weight of success and perfection. As Emily spread her drawings on the table, explaining each one with childlike seriousness, and Grace watched with a quiet pride that no wealth could buy, Thomas understood that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. "This is the park in the summer," Emily explained, pointing to a drawing full of green and yellow. "And this is the way to my school, and here is our house, but with a big garden that I wished we had." Thomas listened, truly listened, for the first time in a long time. He wasn't thinking about what he would say next, wasn't planning strategies, wasn't calculating benefits. He was just present in the moment, learning what it was like to live without the armor he had built around himself. In the days that followed the coffee in Grace's small kitchen, Thomas found himself constantly thinking about that visit. The contrast between the modest apartment and his empty estate haunted him. While driving to the office, while signing documents, while sitting alone at his impeccable dining table, his mind wandered to Emily drawing on the floor, to the coffee in chipped cups, to Grace's direct honesty. It was on a Wednesday morning, during a particularly tedious meeting with investors, that Thomas made a decision. He stood up abruptly in the middle of a presentation by Frank, his vice president, ignoring the surprised glances around the table. "Continue without me," he said simply. "I trust your judgment." He left the conference room, leaving a stunned silence behind. His assistant ran after him down the corridor. "Mr. Graham, is everything all right? You have lunch with Mr. Peterson at 1 p.m., and then the video conference with Tokyo." "Cancel everything," Thomas replied without slowing down. "I'm taking the rest of the day off." "But sir, the East Asia contract..." "It can wait until tomorrow. The company won't go bankrupt because I take an afternoon off, Count Peter." Ignoring his assistant's shocked look, Thomas left the mirrored building that housed his company's headquarters. Inside the car, he took a deep breath, feeling a strange freedom. When was the last time he had done something impulsive, that he had deviated from the meticulously planned script of his life? Instead of driving home, Thomas stopped at a toy store. He walked through the colorful aisles, feeling completely out of place among excited children and smiling employees. Finally, after much hesitation, he chose a large box of professional colored pencils, the kind that real artists would use, not child's toys, but still something he imagined Emily would appreciate. His next stop was at a small organic market. With an uncertainty that did not match his usual business confidence, Thomas selected fresh fruits, artisanal breads, specialty cheeses, fresh juices, things he imagined would be a welcome luxury without being blatant ostentation. As the attendant packed his purchases into a simple basket, Thomas wondered if he wasn't being presumptuous. Who was he to assume that Grace would accept his help, that she needed him in some way? But then he remembered the way she had shared the sandwich, when she clearly had little for herself and Emily. It hadn't been charity, it had been humanity. Perhaps he could reciprocate in the same way. With the grocery basket in the passenger seat and the colored pencil box wrapped in plain paper in the back seat, Thomas drove to the small yellow building. He parked at a discreet distance and walked the rest of the way, feeling strangely nervous. When he rang the intercom, there was a moment of silence before Grace's voice sounded. With a note of surprise she didn't try to hide. Thomas? Is that you? Yes, it's me. I hope I'm not bothering you. Another moment of silence. Is everything all right? Yes, perfectly fine. I just brought some things and thought I'd stop by to say hello. There was a pause, and then the buzz of the door unlocking. Thomas went up the stairs, carrying the basket and the package, feeling his heart beating a little faster than usual. Grace opened the door before he even knocked. She was wearing simple jeans and a blue blouse, her blonde hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. Her green eyes studied Thomas, and then the items he was carrying, a cautious expression crossing her face. "It's nothing much," Thomas said quickly, recognizing the hesitation. "Just some groceries and a small gift for Emily. If it's inappropriate, I apologize. I just wanted to—" "Give back," Grace completed, her face softening a little. She opened the door wider. "And come in. Emily will be happy to see you. She hasn't stopped talking about you." The apartment was tidier than the last time, though it still had the same cozy, lived-in feel. Emily was not in sight. "She's at school," Grace explained, noticing Thomas's gaze. "She should be back in half an hour. The neighbor downstairs picks her up with a few other kids." Thomas nodded, placing the basket on the small kitchen table. "I brought some things I thought you might like. I hope you don't mind." Grace looked at the basket, and Thomas could see a brief struggle on her face, pride competing with practicality. Finally, she smiled slightly. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." As Grace put the items away, Thomas observed the small apartment with new eyes. He had tried to fix it in his imagination before, thinking about how he could renovate it, enlarge it, improve it with his money. Now, he realized that the charm of the place was precisely in its lived-in imperfection, in the signs of a real life being built there. "Aren't you at work?" Grace asked, interrupting his thoughts. "I thought executives like you didn't get days off in the middle of the week." Thomas smiled. "Normally, we don't. But today I decided the company could survive without me for a few hours." Grace raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, she offered, "Would you like some coffee? Or tea?" "Tea would be great, thank you." As Grace prepared the drinks, the conversation flowed surprisingly easily. Thomas discovered that she worked as an administrative assistant at a small neighborhood medical clinic and was studying online to complete a nursing course when Emily was asleep. She didn't mention Emily's father, and Thomas didn't ask. The sound of the door opening interrupted the conversation. Emily burst into the apartment like a bolt of energy, her school backpack swinging, her red coat half open. "Mommy, the teacher loved my drawing and put it up on the classroom wall and everyone—" She stopped abruptly when she saw Thomas, her green eyes widening with surprise and then shining with pure childlike delight. "Uncle Thomas, you came back." The unexpected title, Uncle Thomas, caught him off guard, causing a strange warmth in his chest. Before he could respond, Emily ran up to him and, without any hesitation, hugged his legs. "I told Lily you would come back, but she didn't believe me." Grace gave him an apologetic look. "Emily, give Thomas some space. Not everyone likes surprise hugs." But Thomas was already smiling. "It's all right. It's good to see you too, Emily." "What did you bring?" the girl asked, noticing the wrapped package on the sofa. "Emily," Grace gently chided her. "You don't ask like that." "Sorry," the girl said, not sounding apologetic at all. "But is it for me?" Thomas laughed. "It is. So I thought you might like it." With Grace's silent permission, he handed the package to Emily, who tore it open with the enthusiastic impulsiveness typical of children. Her eyes widened at the sight of the box of professional pencils, with so many colors that they seemed infinite to a 6-year-old. "Wow," she exclaimed, opening the box with reverence. "It even has real gold and silver." Her face lit up in a way that made Thomas think all the millions he had ever earned weren't worth that child's genuine smile. Emily looked at her mother, then at Thomas, then back at the pencils, clearly not knowing what to do with so much joy. "What do you say, Emily?" Grace gently prompted. "Thank you, Uncle Thomas." The girl practically shouted, hugging the box to her chest. Then, as if she had just had the best idea in the world, her eyes sparkled. "Come draw with me, right now." Without waiting for an answer, Emily ran to the living room, tossed her backpack in a corner. and began spreading sheets of paper on the floor. Grace smiled as she watched her daughter, then turned to Thomas. "You've created a monster," she joked, but her tone was affectionate. Emily was already sitting on the floor, arranging the new pencils in a pattern that only made sense to her. She looked up, impatient. "Come on, Uncle Thomas, let's test all the colors." Thomas looked at Grace, who shrugged with a smile. "You better go, she won't give up." Thomas walked to the living room, stopping in front of Emily. The girl patted the floor next to her, indicating where he should sit. Thomas looked at the space, feeling a strange hesitation. "I haven't done this in years. I don't even remember what it was like," he admitted, realizing it was true. When was the last time he had sat on the floor, that he had drawn something without purpose, just for the pleasure of creating? "It's easy," Emily insisted. "You just sit down and draw whatever you want." With a hesitant smile at Grace, who was watching from the kitchen entrance, Thomas carefully sat on the floor. He felt incredibly awkward at first, as if his body had forgotten how to bend without the formal structure of a chair. Emily didn't even notice his discomfort. She immediately pushed a sheet of paper toward him and began selecting pencils. "Let's draw a house. You draw the house, I'll draw the people, and then we'll do the sky together." Thomas picked up a brown pencil that Emily pushed into his hand and looked at the blank paper. For a moment, he felt ridiculously insecure. He, Thomas Graham, CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, intimidated by a sheet of paper and the expectation of a 6-year-old. "I don't know if I'll do this right," he admitted. Emily looked at him as if he had said the most absurd thing in the world. "There's no right way. Just draw it your way." The simplicity of the childlike logic hit him. Thomas began to draw, hesitant lines at first, then more confident. A simple house took shape. Not the estate where he lived, but a cozy house, with big windows and a red door, the kind of place that looked like a real home. Emily, meanwhile, worked with intense concentration on her part of the drawing. Thomas watched her occasionally, admiring the seriousness with which she considered each color, each stroke. "Tadas," she finally announced, leaning back to admire her work. Thomas looked at the paper. Emily had drawn 3 figures holding hands in front of the house, clearly herself, with yellow hair and a red dress. Grace, taller, also blonde, and a male figure that Thomas realized, with a strange emotion in his throat, was him. "Go now the sun," Emily declared, grabbing a vibrant yellow pencil. "You do one side and I'll do the other, and we'll meet in the middle." Thomas obeyed, drawing half of a large circle in the corner of the paper, while Emily did the same on the other side. When the lines met, she laughed delightedly. "See? We made the sun together," she exclaimed, as if it were the greatest achievement in the world. "It's beautiful, Emily," Grace commented, coming closer to see the complete drawing. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of surprise and something softer, when she saw the 3 figures holding hands. Thomas found himself strangely speechless. There was something deeply moving about sitting on the floor, drawing a sun with a child who had included him, without hesitation, in her small world. In the weeks that followed, Thomas found himself gravitating more and more towards the small yellow apartment, first with excuses, bringing small gifts, offering practical help, then simply because he wanted to be there. Gradually, he became part of their routine. He went with Grace to the market on Saturdays, carrying the bags and learning to select fruit by smell and softness, not by perfect appearance. He listened to the fantastic stories Emily created, always full of brave princesses and dragons who ultimately just wanted friends. He learned day by day to live without the constant pressure of schedules and expectations. On a quiet evening, while Emily was asleep and he and Grace were talking in the small living room, Thomas finally verbalized what he had been feeling. "I lived surrounded by luxury, but never by life," he said softly, looking at the drawing Emily had made of him, now framed and hung on the wall as if it were a valuable work of art. Grace smiled, that gentle smile he had begun to look forward to. "Here we value what is priceless." And Thomas, the man who had once measured everything in dollars and cents, discovered that the truly valuable things were those that could never be bought. The sincere smile of a child, the growing trust in Grace's eyes, and the sense of belonging he felt sitting on their living room floor, drawing suns that completed each other. The first change was so subtle that Grace didn't notice it immediately. Thomas arrived on a Thursday afternoon, as had become his habit over the last 2 months, bringing a small cake for Emily's after-school snack. While Grace prepared tea, he casually mentioned, "The bathroom door hinge was making a strange noise. I brought oil and fixed it." "Hope you don't mind." Grace blinked, surprised. "I didn't even notice it was making noise." Thomas shrugged, with a small smile. "I noticed it last time I was here. It just needed some lubrication." The next day, it was the kitchen faucet that stopped dripping. Grace only realized it when harsh in the middle of the night, she got up for water and the silence felt different. It took a few minutes to understand what had changed. The rhythmic sound of drops falling into the sink, which had become part of the apartment's soundscape for so long, had disappeared. She didn't comment on it to Thomas, but she caught him watching her use the faucet the next day. A satisfied gleam in his blue eyes when she didn't have to turn the handle with extra force to stop the leak. The small interventions continued. One weekend, while Grace took Emily to visit a school friend, Thomas asked to stay in the apartment, claiming he had some work emails to answer. When they returned 3 hours later, the unstable living room shelf, which for years had been supported by strategically stacked books, was perfectly level and firm. "It just needed 2 new screws," he explained when Grace noticed the change. "I had them in the car." Over time, Thomas became bolder in his discreet improvements. One afternoon, he arrived with a small toolbox and asked permission to take a look at the kitchen cabinet that wouldn't close properly. Half an hour later, the doors aligned perfectly, and the hinges no longer squeaked. They were neither extravagant nor expensive changes. Thomas seemed to intuitively understand that Grace would refuse anything that sounded like charity or that significantly altered the home she had built with so much effort. He didn't offer to remodel the entire apartment or replace old furniture with new. Instead, he focused on small repairs that made daily life a little easier, a little more comfortable. The broken grate on Emily's bedroom window, which let cold air in on winter nights, was fixed one Saturday morning while the girl was at community ballet class. The hallway light switch, which only worked if pressed at a specific angle, was replaced one Tuesday evening. "You don't have to do these things, Thomas," Grace said one night, watching him replace the burned-out light bulb in the small building entryway, something that didn't just benefit her and Emily, but all the residents. "I know," he replied simply, testing if the new bulb was secure, "but I like to." And it was true. Thomas, who had spent years delegating any manual labor to contracted employees, was now discovering a surprising satisfaction in fixing things with his own hands. There was something profoundly gratifying about seeing the immediate result of his work. The hinge that stopped squeaking, the faucet that no longer dripped, the shelf that remained steady under the weight of Emily's books. In his immaculate estate, everything worked perfectly, maintained by a team of professionals he rarely saw. But nothing there carried the mark of his own hands. In Grace and Emily's small apartment, every small repair had his personal touch. Every subtle improvement was an extension of himself that remained even when he wasn't present. On a particularly pleasant spring Sunday, Thomas suggested they paint the faded frame of the living room window. He brought white paint, brushes, and drop cloths to protect the floor. Emily, enthusiastic about the idea of participating, was given a small brush and the important mission of painting the lower part of the frame. "Be careful not to get too messy," Grace warned, though her tone indicated she already expected the opposite. The three worked together, with Emily telling elaborate stories about a world where windows were magical portals to other places. Thomas listened with genuine attention, asking questions that further fueled the girl's imagination. Grace, watching them, felt something warm and indefinable grow in her chest. By late afternoon, the window frame shone with the new paint, and there were small white smudges on everyone's clothes, including a smudge on the tip of Thomas's nose, placed there by a giggling Emily when he was distracted. The following week, it was the turn of the wooden fence that separated the small communal patio behind the building. Some slats were broken, others loose, making the space less safe for children to play. Thomas arrived one Saturday morning with new boards, nails, a can of green paint, and work gloves. "I thought we could make this a project for the day," he suggested to Grace, who watched him with a mixture of surprise and something that looked almost like tenderness. Emily, of course, was ecstatic about the idea of an outdoor project. She put on her own gloves, several times larger than her small hands, and followed Thomas with the seriousness of a dedicated apprentice, holding nails when asked and handing tools with clumsy efficiency. By the end of the day, the fence was repaired, partially painted. They would finish the next day, and there was a new sense of shared satisfaction among the three. Thomas noticed how Grace's smile seemed lighter, how her shoulders seemed less tense. Small changes, almost imperceptible to those who weren't paying close attention, but Thomas was. On a quiet afternoon, while Grace prepared dinner and Thomas changed the burned-out light bulb on the small balcony, he heard Emily's excited voice calling from the living room, "Uncle Thomas, come see what I drew!" Thomas finished securing the new bulb and walked in. Emily was sitting on the floor, surrounded by her colored pencils and several sheets of paper covered with colorful drawings. Her green eyes shone with pride as she held up one particular drawing. It was a representation of their small makeshift family, Grace, Emily, and him, working together on the patio fence. The strokes were childlike but full of life and movement. In the drawing, everyone wore huge stick-figure smiles, and there were hearts drawn above their heads. "This is you fixing our house," Emily explained, pointing to the figure that obviously represented him. "And here's the new fence we painted green. The teacher said it was very good, and that I captured the essence of family cooperation." Thomas felt something catch in his throat. "That's incredible, Emily," he managed to say. "Did you really like it?" Emily asked, her eyes large and hopeful. "I liked it very much. It's one of the most beautiful drawings I've ever seen." Emily's smile lit up her entire face. "Here, I'm going to hang it on the refrigerator, right in the middle. It's the place of honor for the best drawings." As he watched her run to the kitchen, the drawing held triumphantly above her head, Thomas felt a smile form on his own face. Uncle Thomas. That simple title touched him more deeply than any business title, any professional success he had ever had. In his previous life, he had been Mr. Graham, his chief executive officer, chairman of the board, imposing titles that created distance, that demarcated power and status. But none of them had ever made him feel as valued, as needed, as the simple Uncle Thomas, in the enthusiastic voice of a 6-year-old girl. Grace watched from the window as Thomas said goodbye to Emily in the building's courtyard. The girl hugged him impulsively, as she always did, and Thomas returned the hug with a naturalness that seemed to have developed over the months. He said something that made Emily laugh, then waved one last time before walking to his car parked on the street. When Emily ran up the stairs and entered the apartment, her face was illuminated with joy. "Uncle Thomas said he's going to help me build a birdhouse for my science project," she announced, tossing her backpack onto the sofa. "And we're going to paint it yellow because yellow attracts happy birds," Grace smiled, stepping away from the window. "That sounds great, honey. Now go wash your hands for dinner." As Emily ran to the bathroom, Grace began setting the table, her thoughts wandering. Thomas had become a constant presence in their lives over the past 4 months. At first, she had maintained a cautious distance, waiting to find some hidden motivation, some interest beyond genuine friendship. Men like Thomas Graham, rich, successful, powerful, did not usually frequent small apartments in modest neighborhoods without a reason. But as the weeks passed, Grace began to realize that perhaps Thomas's interest was exactly what it seemed, a real human connection, an escape from the elegant solitude of his previous life, a chance to experience the kind of honest simplicity that all his money couldn't buy. And that scared her deeply. It wasn't just the fear that one day he would simply disappear, taking away the joy he had brought into Emily's life. It was the more complicated fear that he wouldn't disappear, that he would continue to integrate into their lives until he became indispensable, until Grace started to depend on him, to trust him, to... She stopped the thought before it could fully form. She placed the plates on the table harder than necessary, making them clink. Grace knew the feeling of abandonment well. She knew the pain of building a life with someone, only to see him leave when responsibilities became too real. When a family was no longer a romantic idea but a demanding reality. Emily was only 2 years old when her father decided he wasn't ready to be a dad, leaving Grace to raise her daughter alone. Not that Thomas had given any indication of wanting more than friendship. He was scrupulously respectful, maintaining an appropriate distance, never crossing the boundaries Grace had silently set. But there were moments, a look that lasted a little longer, a shared smile when Emily said something particularly charming, that made Grace wonder if there wasn't something more growing between them. "I washed with soap, see?" Emily declared, showing her palms as she returned from the bathroom. "Can I put out the napkins?" "Of course, dear." Grace pushed her uneasy thoughts aside, focusing on the present moment, on her daughter. Meanwhile, miles away, Thomas was driving back to his estate, lost in his own thoughts. His cell phone rang several times, probably Frank or some other executive with urgent business questions that suddenly seemed far less important than they used to be. The house was exactly as he had left it, impeccable, silent, empty. Thomas walked through the spacious rooms, noticing how every step echoed in the silence. He stopped in front of a framed photograph on the wall, he and Caroline on their wedding day, both smiling at the camera, young and hopeful for the future. Why did he still keep that photo? Perhaps as a reminder, a visible scar of what happens when you trust too much, when you let your guard down, when you allow someone to become too important. Thomas poured himself a drink and sat down in the spacious living room. Somewhere inside him, a fear was growing. Not the familiar fear of being betrayed again, but a new, more terrifying fear, that he wasn't worthy of the trust Emily so easily placed in him, of the cautious friendship Grace was slowly offering him. Who was he to enter their lives? A man who had spent years building walls around himself, who had turned business success into a substitute for real connections, who had forgotten what it was like to be part of a family. What if he messed everything up? What if, when it truly mattered, he turned out to be as inadequate as Caroline had made him believe he was? Thomas took a sip of his drink, feeling the sharp contrast between this moment and the hours he had just spent in the small apartment filled with laughter, where he had helped Emily with her homework while Grace prepared a simple meal. There, he felt alive. Here, he felt like a ghost inhabiting an elegant mausoleum. His cell phone rang again. Thomas looked at the name on the screen. It was Frank, probably with some corporate crisis that couldn't wait until tomorrow. But before he could answer, the call dropped and a text popped up on the screen. It was a photo sent by Grace, Emily holding a colorful piece of paper, obviously a handmade invitation. The message read, "Someone is anxious to give you this in person, but couldn't wait until you come tomorrow." Thomas zoomed in on the image to get a better look at the invitation. It was decorated with hand-drawn stars and moons and said in colorful letters, "School play presentation, the adventures of the brave princess." In the corner, Emily had written in her childlike handwriting, "I am the princess." As he looked at the photo, his cell phone rang again, this time a call from Grace. Thomas answered immediately. "Hello?" Emily's voice sounded from the other end. She had obviously snatched her mother's phone. "Uncle Thomas, did you see the invitation Mommy sent?" Thomas smiled, feeling the tension leave his shoulders. "I did, Emily. It's a very beautiful invitation." "I'm the main princess," Emily declared proudly. "The teacher said I have a lot of, What is it again, Mommy?" There was a pause and Grace's distant voice. "That's it, stage presence. Do you know what that is?" "It means you shine on stage," Thomas explained, smiling. "That when you're there, people can't look at anyone else." "Yeah, that's exactly it," Emily agreed enthusiastically. "So, are you going to come see?" There was a vulnerability in the question that struck Thomas to his core. Beneath the childlike excitement, he could hear the need for confirmation, the hope that he would be there to witness her moment of glory. "It's Friday night at 7 o'clock, Emily continued, her voice now a little more hesitant. "So Mommy said you're probably busy with important work, but I said maybe—" "Emily," Thomas interrupted gently. "Of course I'll come see you in the play. I wouldn't miss it for the world." The scream of joy on the other end of the line was so loud that Thomas had to hold the phone away from his ear, laughing. "I knew it. I told Mommy you would come," Emily exclaimed. "So I'm going to save a special seat for you, right in the front." There was a noise and then Grace's voice replaced Emily's. "I'm sorry about that," she said, an audible smile in her voice. "She's a little excited about this play." "No need to apologize," Thomas replied. "I'm honored by the invitation." There was a small pause. "For you really don't have to go if you're busy," Grace said softly, probably so Emily wouldn't hear. "I know Friday night must be complicated with your work." Thomas understood what she was doing, giving him an out, a way to back down without disappointing Emily, protecting her daughter as she always did. "Grace," he said firmly, "I want to go. I will rearrange any commitment I have. This is important." Another moment of silence and then, "Thank you, Thomas." Her voice held something he couldn't quite identify. Gratitude, yes, but also a rare vulnerability. After he hung up, Thomas sat for a long time, looking at the colorful invitation on his cell phone screen. Somewhere between his lonely estate and the small, cozy apartment, between his past of disappointments and an uncertain future, Emily had become a bridge over the abyss of fears that both he and Grace carried, but rarely named. The fears were still there. Grace still feared becoming attached to someone only to see them leave when the novelty wore off. Thomas still feared not being enough, not knowing how to be part of a real family. But for Emily, for that child who offered love and trust without reservation, perhaps both were willing to face those fears, one small step at a time. Emily's school play was a success. As the protagonist, the little girl shone on the makeshift stage of the school gym, reciting her lines with surprising confidence for a 6-year-old. Her stage presence was undeniable. Even when she wasn't speaking, all eyes turned to the brave princess with a gold paper crown and a cape made of colorful scraps. Thomas, sitting in the front row exactly where Emily had promised to save a seat, applauded enthusiastically at the end of the presentation. Beside him, Grace discreetly wiped away a tear of pride. When the curtains closed and the children left to receive the applause, Emily ran directly to them, ignoring the protocol of remaining with the other actors. "Did you see? I didn't forget any lines," she exclaimed, throwing herself into Grace's arms. "We did, my love. You were amazing," Grace replied, hugging her daughter tightly. Emily then turned to Thomas, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "What did you think, Uncle Thomas? Was I a good princess?" "The best princess I've ever seen," Thomas answered sincerely. "And I've seen a lot of plays." That was true. Thomas had attended Broadway productions, operas in historic European theaters, performances by renowned companies around the world, but none had touched him like that simple school play, with cardboard sets and children stumbling over their lines. Emily's teacher approached, smiling. "She has a lot of talent," she commented. She was one of the few children who didn't need help memorizing her lines. "She practiced a lot at home," Grace explained. "Even the neighbors already knew the story of the brave princess." Well, the effort paid off. "Oh, we're having a small celebration with juice and cookies in the classroom. You're welcome to join us." Emily pulled Thomas's hand. "Come on, Uncle Thomas, there are chocolate chip cookies." The Uncle Thomas did not go unnoticed by the teacher, who looked curiously from Thomas to Grace, clearly trying to understand the relationship. But she didn't ask any questions, just smiled and walked away to invite other parents. The post-performance celebration lasted almost an hour. Emily ran among her classmates, still dressed as a princess, accepting compliments with an adorable mix of pride and shyness. Thomas watched from a distance, feeling a strange sense of belonging. Some parents greeted him, assuming he was part of Emily's family, and he did not correct them. On the way back, Emily fell asleep in the back seat of Thomas's car, exhausted by the day's excitement. Grace turned around occasionally to check on her daughter, smiling to see her sleeping soundly, the princess crown still firmly placed on her head. "She won't want to take that off even to sleep," she commented in a low voice. Thomas smiled, glancing briefly in the rearview mirror. "She deserves to wear a crown. She was truly incredible today." "She was." Grace looked out the window, watching the streets go by. "Thank you for coming, Thomas. It meant a lot to her." "Don't thank me. I wouldn't have missed it for anything." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but full of unexpressed thoughts. When they arrived at the building, Thomas parked and offered to carry Emily. Careful not to wake her, he carried her in his arms up to the apartment, following Grace up the stairs. In Emily's small but cozy room, Grace carefully removed the crown and cape, while Thomas waited at the door. The girl barely moved, only sighing softly when her mother tucked her under the floral duvet. Back in the living room, Grace offered a cup of tea, which Thomas accepted. As she moved in the small kitchen, he noticed a new drawing taped to the refrigerator, apparently a portrait of today's play with a golden-crowned Emily center stage. She drew that last night, Grace explained, noticing his gaze as she placed the cups on the table. She was so anxious she couldn't sleep. Thomas smiled, sitting down. She has talent. Not just for acting, but for art too. Grace nodded, sitting across from him. There was a different quality in the air tonight, something softer, more vulnerable, as if the shared emotion of Emily's performance had knocked down some of the carefully maintained barriers between them. "Thomas," Grace began after a few moments of silence, her voice calm but direct, as always. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure," he replied, though he felt a slight tightening of apprehension. Grace looked at her cup of tea for a moment, as if gathering courage. When she looked up, there was an intensity in her gaze that captivated him. "Have you ever thought about having children?" The question caught him off guard, not just because of its personal nature, but because it touched on a sensitive point he rarely discussed. Thomas placed his cup on the table, organizing his thoughts. "I always wanted to," he finally replied, his voice lower than normal. "Since I was young, I imagined I would have a large family someday." He paused, feeling the weight of unsaid words. "But my wife cheated on me. She left before that could happen. Since then, I never tried again." Thomas didn't go into detail about how he and Caroline had planned to start a family, how they had even prepared a nursery in the new house they had bought together. He didn't mention how, after discovering the betrayal, he had kept that room locked for years, unable to turn it into anything else, unable to let go of the dream that had died there. Grace didn't respond with words. She didn't offer platitudes about how he would find someone else, or how there was still time. She didn't express pity or exaggerated sympathy. She simply remained, her green eyes meeting his with a silent understanding that spoke more than any words could. In that silence, Thomas felt something unclench within him, a knot of pain and disappointment that he had carried for so long that it had become a part of him. The simplicity of Grace's presence, her silent acceptance of his vulnerability, was a balm he hadn't known he needed. The moment was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway, still half asleep, her blonde hair disheveled and her eyes half closed. "I thought you had already left," she murmured, looking at Thomas. "I'm still here," he replied with a gentle smile. "Just having tea with your mother," Emily approached, dragging her feet. "I wanted to give you something before you go." "Emily, it's late," Grace began, but the girl was already running back to her room. She returned moments later, holding a folded sheet of paper. With a seriousness that contrasted with her teddy bear pajamas, she handed the paper to Thomas. "I made this after school yesterday, but I forgot to give it to you today." Thomas carefully opened the paper. It was a drawing made with the professional pencils he had given Emily months ago. It showed 3 figures holding hands under a large yellow and orange sun, a blonde-haired woman, Grace, a girl with a crown, Emily, and a tall man with blonde hair and blue eyes, Thomas. The figures were in front of a house that looked like an idealized version of the small building where they lived, with colorful flowers all around and birds in the sky. At the top of the page, in large, colorful letters, Emily had written a single word: family. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. He looked at Emily, who was watching him anxiously. "Did you like it?" she asked. "I used the special colors to make it prettier." "It's perfect, Emily," he managed to say, his voice a little rough. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received." Satisfied with the answer, Emily smiled broadly, then yawned. "Can I go back to bed now?" Grace stood up. "I'll take you back, Princess. Say good night to Thomas." "Good night, Uncle Thomas," Emily murmured, suddenly sleepy again. She approached and gave him a quick hug before taking her mother's hand. As Grace led Emily back to bed, Thomas looked at the drawing again. Carefully, he folded it and placed it in his wallet, not in the section where he kept credit cards or banknotes, but in the innermost compartment, where he kept the truly important things. When Grace returned, Thomas was already standing, ready to say goodbye. Did she fall asleep again? Almost instantly, Grace confirmed with a soft smile. Then she noticed the absence of the drawing on the table. Did you keep it? Thomas nodded, lightly touching the pocket where his wallet was. I'm going to keep it with me. Something passed over Grace's face, a rare vulnerability, a flash of unfiltered emotion. She saw the gesture for what it truly was, not just an adult humoring a child's gift, but a man recognizing and valuing what that simple drawing represented. Grace then smiled, in a way that Thomas had never seen before. It wasn't her usual smile, contained, careful, measured. This one was softer at the corners, more open, more full of possibilities. It was the smile of someone who, after a long time of holding her own heart tightly, begins to consider the idea of letting go a little. The smile of someone who sees the fear begin to dissipate. Thomas said nothing, just returned the smile, instinctively understanding the subtle shift that had occurred between them. Some truths didn't need to be spoken aloud to be perfectly understood. As he left the apartment that night, Thomas felt lighter than he had in years. The drawing in his wallet was more than paper and color. It was a promise, a possibility, a reminder that families come in all shapes and sizes, and sometimes are found in the most unexpected places. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a silver curtain that turned the streets into liquid mirrors and fogged the windows with a veil of droplets. Inside the small apartment, the contrast couldn't be greater. The air was warm and scented with the aroma of bread baking in the oven. A simple recipe Grace had learned from her grandmother and was now teaching Emily. It was a lazy Saturday, the kind that invites coziness and introspection. Thomas had arrived in the early afternoon, bringing ingredients for the bread and a new set of watercolor paints for Emily, who had shown interest in trying the technique after seeing some paintings in a library book. Now as the rain drummed on the windows, a comfortable silence had settled in the living room. Emily was lying face down on the rug, concentrating on a sheet of paper where she was creating a colorful world with her new paints. Grace was sitting on the small sofa, a sewing basket beside her, patiently mending the loose hem of Emily's school uniform. And Thomas, sitting in the armchair that had tacitly become his over the months, watched the two with a contemplative expression. From time to time, Emily would lift her paper to show the progress of her painting, receiving smiles of approval from both Grace and Thomas. The sound of the rain, mixed with the occasional clinking of Grace's needle and Emily's enthusiastic comments about her colors, created a domestic symphony that Thomas had never experienced before. "Look, Uncle Thomas, I mixed the blue with the yellow and it turned green, but a different green from the pencil," Emily exclaimed, showing a patch of wet color on her paper. "It's emerald green," Thomas replied, leaning in for a closer look. "It's a very special color." "What's emerald?" "It's a precious stone, very valuable," he explained. "It has exactly that color." Emily considered this seriously. "So my painting has a valuable color?" "It does," Thomas smiled. "So how about the painting is valuable for what you put into it, not just for the color?" Grace looked up from her sewing, meeting Thomas's gaze over Emily's head. There was a gentle appreciation in her look, for his patience with her daughter's endless questions, for the way he always responded seriously, never treating Emily's curiosities as trivial or tiresome. Over the last few months, a comfortable routine had established itself between them. Thomas came over almost daily, sometimes just for dinner, other times spending entire afternoons with them on weekends. When he traveled for business, he called every night to hear Emily recount her day. He had started keeping a toothbrush in their bathroom, a change of clothes in the small hallway closet. It hadn't been discussed or formalized. It simply happened, like water finding its natural course as it flows. The oven timer sounded, pulling Thomas from his thoughts. "The bread!" Emily shouted, jumping up, careful not to knock over her paints. Grace put her sewing aside. "I'll take it out of the oven. Keep painting, honey." "Can I help?" Thomas offered, also standing up. In the small kitchen, the two moved in a now familiar dance, avoiding bumping into each other in the limited space. Grace opened the oven and the aroma of fresh bread intensified, enveloping them in a cloud of comfort. "It looks perfect," Thomas commented, observing the golden bread as Grace placed it on a wire rack to cool. "We'll see when we cut it," she replied, but her smile indicated she was also pleased with the result. They returned to the living room, where Emily had resumed her position on the floor, but was now painting with renewed inspiration, likely stimulated by the smell of fresh bread permeating the apartment. Thomas returned to the armchair, but this time, something was different. As he watched Grace return to her sewing, and Emily murmuring to herself as she painted, a certainty crystallized within him, a truth that perhaps had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to be recognized. This small apartment, with its simple furniture and its walls that needed a new coat of paint in some corners, and windows that sometimes jammed when the weather was too humid, with Emily's drawings decorating the refrigerator and the small repairs he himself had made over the months, this place had become more of a home to him than his estate ever was. And these two people, this strong, kind woman who had rebuilt her life after being abandoned, this curious, affectionate child who saw magic in the world around her, they had become his family in a way that no bond of blood could surpass. The thought should have scared him. Instead, it brought a clarity that was almost painful in its perfection. "Uncle Thomas, are you okay?" Emily's voice brought him back to the present moment. "You're looking at us with a funny face." Grace had also looked up, her expression a mixture of curiosity and something more, something that looked almost like hope. Thomas took a deep breath. He had faced hostile boards of directors, negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, made decisions that would affect hundreds of lives, but none of that compared to what he was about to say. "I never knew what it was like to have a real family," he began, his voice lower than normal. "My parents were present, but distant. And then, well, you know how my marriage ended." Emily abandoned her painting, sitting up and looking at him with complete attention. Grace put her sewing aside, her eyes never leaving his. "But here," Thomas continued, looking around the small space that somehow held more life than all the rooms of his estate combined, "with you, I found what I never had." The rain continued outside, creating a sonic cocoon around them, as if the world were giving them the necessary privacy for this moment. "I wanted to know if I can stay," he finally said, the words coming out with a vulnerability he had never allowed himself. "Not as a visitor, but as someone who wants to form a family with you." The silence that followed seemed to contain all the possibilities of the universe. Thomas could hear his own heart beating, each beat echoing the same question. Too soon, too intense, asking for too much. Grace took a deep breath, her green eyes bright with contained emotion. Emily, who seemed to have perfectly understood what was happening, got up and approached Thomas. With the naturalness that only children possess, she took his hand and held it firmly, as if anchored to him. "Does that mean you're going to live here?" Emily asked, her green eyes so similar to her mother's shining with expectation. "Forever?" Thomas looked at Grace, leaving the answer to her. This was a moment where the words needed to be hers. Grace slowly stood up and approached. There were unshed tears in her eyes, but her face showed a serenity that Thomas had rarely seen. "If it's with us," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion, "then it already is." 3 simple words, but they carried the weight of an answer Thomas barely dared to hope for. Emily let out a little shriek of joy and threw her arms around Thomas's waist. "I knew it," she exclaimed. "I told Mommy you wanted to be our real family." Thomas hugged the girl with one arm, while extending his other hand to Grace, who accepted it without hesitation. When their fingers intertwined, Thomas felt as if a circle had been completed, as if all the pain, all the losses, all the winding paths they had taken were just to lead them to this perfect moment. And so, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, with the smell of freshly baked bread in the air and an unfinished painting drying on the floor, something new and precious was formed, without a contract, without an announcement, without a grand ceremony. Just 3 hearts recognizing what, perhaps they had known for a long time, that family is not something you are born into, but something you find, build, and choose every day. What they had now was something neither of them had planned, but which all of them, in their most secret hearts, had desired: a place to belong, people to love, and the certainty that, no matter how heavy the rain outside, within those imperfect walls they had found the perfect meaning of the word home. 6 months had passed since that rainy afternoon. The golden autumn painted the trees in the small nearby park with shades of amber and red, and a new routine had settled into the apartment that now housed not 2, but 3 people. The place remained the same in its structure, small, with walls that needed new paint in some corners, and windows that sometimes jammed when the weather was too humid. But its interior had been transformed, not by major renovations or expensive furniture, but by the constant presence of 3 people building a life together. A new bookshelf in the living room, made by Thomas himself, housed children's books mixed with business manuals and novels that Grace liked to read before bed. The refrigerator, in addition to Emily's drawings, now displayed a calendar where 3 different types of handwriting marked school commitments, work meetings, and weekend plans. A small vase with fresh flowers, something Thomas insisted on maintaining, occupied the center of the kitchen table. New photos had appeared on the walls: Thomas and Emily building a sandcastle, Grace holding a bouquet of wildflowers, the 3 of them together, identical smiles lighting up their faces. Toys that were once carefully put away were now sometimes forgotten in the living room, creating that cozy clutter that only a true home possesses. Thomas's estate had been sold, but not to buy a bigger or more luxurious house. Instead, the money was largely invested for Emily's future education, for the stability that Grace had always worked so hard to provide. Thomas kept his job, but had drastically reduced his hours, delegating more responsibilities, finally understanding that professional success meant little without time to live it with those he loved. On that Tuesday afternoon, Thomas arrived home earlier than usual. Home. The word still caught him by surprise sometimes, not because of its strangeness, but because of the perfection with which it fit when thinking of the small apartment. As he opened the door, he was greeted by the sweet aroma of cake baking and the sound of Emily's laughter coming from the kitchen. He left his briefcase on the hook beside the door and followed the sounds and smells that indicated life, presence, home. "I'm home," he announced, though it was unnecessary. Emily was already running toward him, a sheet of paper in one hand and flour on the tip of her nose. "Dad, you're right on time," she exclaimed, hugging him quickly before holding up the paper. "I finished my homework for tomorrow and I want you to read it." Dad. The word was still new enough to make his heart skip a little beat. It hadn't been a planned or discussed transition. It simply happened, about 2 months after he had moved in. Emily had alternated between Uncle Thomas and Dad for a few weeks, until the second option settled in naturally, as if it had always been that way. "I'll read it with great pleasure," Thomas replied, taking the paper as he followed Emily into the kitchen, where Grace was supervising the cake in the oven. "You're early," Grace commented with a smile, rising for a brief kiss. Her hair was pulled up in a makeshift bun, with blonde strands escaping to frame her face. "The meeting ended early," he explained, "and I missed you." "Read it now, Dad," Emily insisted, tugging on his sleeve and pointing to the paper. Thomas looked at the ruled sheet where Emily had carefully written, in her still-developing childish hand. At the top of the page, she had written, "My family," and decorated the words with small, colorful stars. He began to read aloud, "My Family," by Emily Marshall Graham. "My family is small but very cool. There is me, my mom, and my dad. My mom is Grace. She works helping doctors take care of sick people. She knows how to make the best hot chocolate in the world and tells me stories before bed, even when she's tired. My dad is Thomas. He draws with me, teaches me to garden, and likes bread with jam. He wasn't my dad before, but now he is, and he's the best dad anyone could want. My teacher asked what makes a family a family. I think you don't have to be born together. We found each other and decided to be a family because we love each other. Some kids in my class have big families with lots of brothers and sisters, but my family, even though it's small, has a lot of love. The end." Thomas finished reading. his voice cracking slightly on the last sentence. He looked at Emily, who was watching him anxiously. "Was it good?" she asked. "The teacher said to write about our family." Thomas knelt down to her eye level. "It's perfect, Emily. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever read." "Really? More beautiful than those big contracts you read at work?" Thomas laughed, feeling his eyes moisten. "Goes million times more beautiful. Can I keep a copy?" "Of course. I'll make a special one for you to keep in your work briefcase." Emily ran off to get paper and pencils, leaving Thomas and Grace alone in the kitchen. He stood up, still holding the original text, unable to take his eyes off those simple words that meant everything. "My dad is Thomas." Grace approached, resting her head on his shoulder as she looked at the paper. "She worked on that all afternoon," she commented softly. "She wanted it to be perfect for you to read." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice at that moment. His heart felt too big for his chest, filled with an emotion he had never experienced before meeting Grace and Emily. "You know," Grace said, turning to look him in the eyes, "you turned into the man you always dreamed of, and all it took was opening your heart." The words hit him with their simple truth. For years, he had pursued success, recognition, perfection, believing he would find happiness when he reached certain goals, when he accumulated enough, when he proved his worth through external achievements. He never imagined that the answer was in something as simple and as difficult as lowering his defenses and allowing himself to be loved. The following weekend, Thomas and Emily worked together on a small project she had suggested, a plaque for the apartment door. Using recycled wood from an old box, they sanded, painted, and decorated a simple but meaningful sign. On Sunday afternoon, the three gathered in the building hallway for the official inauguration ceremony, as Emily had called it. The plaque was carefully hung next to the door. In letters painted by Thomas's hand, it read, "Hearts Unseen," a name that had come up during one of the late-night conversations between him and Grace, when they talked about how the unexpected sometimes brings the greatest gifts. And below, in colorful, slightly crooked letters, Emily had added her contribution, "Here lives a family no one saw coming, not even themselves." Grace laughed softly as she read the phrase. "Where did you get that from, Emily?" The girl shrugged with the natural wisdom of children. "It's true, isn't it? No one knew we were going to be a family. Not even us." Thomas put one arm around Grace and the other around Emily, contemplating the small plaque that said so much in so few words. He remembered that winter night when he had walked aimlessly through the snowy streets, feeling more lost than ever. How could he have imagined that moment of desperation would lead him to the home he had always sought? How could Grace have foreseen that the stranger she offered half a sandwich to would become an indispensable part of her life? Life rarely follows the paths we plan. Sometimes it is the unexpected detours, the painful losses, the moments of complete disorientation that lead us exactly where we were meant to be. As the three stepped back into the apartment, their home, their refuge, Thomas thought of unseen hearts finally finding their place, of a family that no one could predict, of a love that didn't need announcements or explanations to simply exist and grow day after day, in the small moments that together make up a shared life. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.